Okay, it is 11 o'clock. Welcome, all of you who are attending. We appreciate you joining us. Maybe we'll have some other people joining as we begin here, and that'd be great. This is the 11 o'clock session. This is our panel discussion on what is academic freedom. And I'm going to very quickly announce or introduce rather you guys, and I'm just going to kind of go around how you guys are on my screen. So we have here Dr. Alex Ebay, who is the Dean of Academics here at Weatherford College. We have Dr. Philip Mathew, who is the director of the new Bachelor of Applied Arts and Sciences in Organizational Leadership. We have Christi Dayley, who is our Associate Professor of Government. We have Dr. William Smith, who is Associate Professor in English. And we have our student panelist, China Smith. Really appreciate you guys agreeing to do this and joining us for the panel. Just a word here to you guys who are attending. If you would like to ask a question, we cannot see you or hear you, as you may have heard me say before. So feel free to watch this in your pajamas or whatever. There's no danger of you showing up on any recording like that. But if you do have a question, I'm going to ask that you ask it in the QA section. If you scroll at the bottom of your screen, those buttons that show up, you'll see Q&A. If you click on that, there's an option for you to input a question. I'm going to ask that you put your questions there rather than in the chat. The chat is a place that you can interact with each other if you want to during the session, but the QA is where I'm going to go for questions to the panel. Feel free to ask your question anytime you want to that way, and I'll be looking at those as we go through the discussion. All right, so are you guys ready?
Yep.
So we're just going to start right off the bat with the first one. This is just out there to any of you. What is academic freedom?
Okay, I'll jump in. I actually have a definition pulled up so I could refer to it just to get us rolling. Academic freedom is a moral and legal concept expressing the conviction that the freedom of inquiry, particularly by faculty, is essential to the mission of the academy as well as the principles of academia, and that scholars should have freedom to teach or communicate ideas.
Wonderful. Let me just follow up by adding more to it that academic freedom is the freedom for faculty and students to teach, study, and pursue knowledge and research or scholarly inquiry without unreasonable interference or restriction from law, institutional regulation, or public pressure.
Anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, I like the definitions so far. I think at its very heart, I think we could say academic freedom is the pursuit of truth. You know, and this is an idea that goes back centuries. But if you want to put it in a nutshell, it's the pursuit of truth, but it's done within some parameters as well, which we could probably get into later.
Okay, so let's move on then. With these kind of definitions in place, why would you guys say that academic freedom is important? And I have another kind of wrinkle on that. I would ask the question, what does academic freedom grant us? What does it give us? I was having this conversation with some friends of mine over the last couple of days, some other philosophers, and they were suggesting that academic freedom, unlike free will that we just have, you know, this is just kind of a feature of human experience, academic freedom is something that tends to be granted by an institution. So if the institution grants us as faculty and students free will, to pursue this truth or to pursue scholarly inquiry, what is it exactly that we're being granted? What are we being given that we don't already have?
Well, you're allowed to be creative within your teaching, make it more personal to the students with, like, instead of using textbooks that might be outdated, you have current events that you can use within your class.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a teaching perspective, obviously, I think China puts it in really good terms that you're trying to engage students and get as close to truth, as Dr. Mathew suggested, as you can. And so academic freedom allows faculty and students to to give them some latitude for figuring out what the best path is for getting close to truth. I'm going to push back a little bit, though, Greg, on the way you framed it. I don't think that the institution grants us academic freedom so much as the institution recognizes academic freedom. I think that, as Dr. Mathew pointed out, academic freedom is a concept that has existed for a long time, and it's sort of encoded in, at least in American terms, in the statement from the American Association of University Professors in 1940, a statement on academic freedom, and institutions recognize that statement, but the institution is not granting academic freedom. And I think the reason that I want to really hit that point specifically is that if an institution grants academic freedom, the institution can take academic freedom away.
Yeah, and that was part of the concern, or not concern, but part of the conversation I had with my friends is that, look, it is their contention was that it does seem like something that they could take away, but ultimately this was their point, what academic freedom grants you, what it is giving you freedom to do is something that they can't take away. So in other words, if academic freedom grants an uninhibited approach to scholarly inquiry or pursuit of truth, or as China put it, freedom of instructional style, that an institution might say, look, we're not going to allow you that freedom, but I still have maybe an obligation to still do those things, right? But that could be just splitting hairs at this point.
I think China brings up a good point, something I was thinking of too. I think it's really important to recognize, I think Dr. Ibe noted this too. Isn't it from the movie Spider-Man, where they say with great freedom comes great responsibility, something like that. So I think that same principle applies here, is that academic freedom, it's a scholarly pursuit for the professors or the faculty of the institution, but ultimately it's not only about us. It's also about the students too, because that's something hopefully we're all engaged in as scholars, as faculty, but also as students who will become scholars or are interested, in whatever career they want to pursue, that they are exposed to different ideas, like she said, current events, all these, influence academic freedom. So there's two parts to that.
Let me jump in here. I agree. But I also think that we have to look at it from the perspective of our job. I think there's a difference between academic freedom with regard to your own research, which should be probably as free as it can be, versus your in the classroom instruction. And something China said about current events. For me, I teach my class from the perspective of current events as much as I can. But there's a fine line in the classroom between how much freedom you can have exploring current events, because it's very political and it's very opinion driven. And I think you have to be able to separate that in the classroom from what you're doing maybe in your own time with regard to research. What do you think?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, so when it comes to that, I think academic freedom protects the fact that you can teach in a creative style, but it does not protect your political views or how you outlook it for yourself, but how you view it to the students.
I think that's a good answer.
So I understand the fine line there, and it's easily crossed, but with, I think, the right perspective on it, you can keep it pretty neutral.
And Christi, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were suggesting too that there's a distinction between your pursuit of your own academic work, which may line up with your own personal views, versus how you present the material that you're tasked to teach the students in the classroom. And there can be a place for overlap. So for example, right, I'm my religious convictions are Christianity, and there's an overlap between that and what I teach in philosophy, specifically when we get into ethics. I often will use my own beliefs as kind of an example of how somebody might think through these issues, but never as a, this is what it is, and you now must, you know, reproduce this on an exam or something like that, right?
Absolutely.
But that doesn't stop me from pursuing my own academic interest freely, which may be certainly in accord and in alignment with my views.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It doesn't, if you are pursuing your own interest, as long as it's the truth, you are not given a blanket of freedom to just say whatever you want to say. You can say something to the extent that you are expressing views. Maybe it's a view of that is shared by many in the society. It could be views, political views. It doesn't really matter, as long as you allow your students, as long as you allow your audience to participate and be able to express equally, you know, their own views. You know, you are not repressing anybody's view, and you are not imposing your views upon those whom you are teaching. So that's why it's a scholarly inquiry, where people come together and be able to talk freely, you know, whether it's your personal belief or not, we don't care. Just talk freely and arrive at a truth of some sort and go from there. So that's what academic freedom is all about. However, when you begin to repress other people's views or try to punish your students from expressing their own views, then you have crossed the line.
Well, and again, I think the scholarly community, and more specifically the AAUP, has recognized that students have academic freedom in the classroom as well. You know, I mean, that I think you're right, Alex, as soon as your approach as a faculty member, as an instructor, is taking away a student's right to their own academic freedom, then you've got a problem.
So let's go there for just a minute. So it's clear that, you know, I've heard this from a couple of you at this point, that academic freedom extends both to instructors as well as to students. China, I want to ask you this question. What do you see as the different standard? Because it seems like there probably is a different standard of what that academic freedom looks like, right? Maybe it's not a different standard of the freedom itself, but maybe how it's applied, what it looks like. How does academic freedom look from the perspective of the student? What do you see as your academic freedoms?
Well, for us, we have our student evaluations that were given at the end of the semester, which helps us kind of voice how we felt about the class, how it's taught. But a lot of times, a lot of us feel like those student evaluations, as they might seem very helpful to y'all, they sometimes aren't looked at in a whole view, or like they don't change anything. So it's a way for us to talk about it, but sometimes there's no change on our end.
Well, and that's helpful in maybe helping direct how academic freedom is seen and understood and applied from for the instructor. But as you see academic freedom, you being given academic freedom, right? The freedom, as we've talked about, to pursue intellectually, honestly, to pursuit of truth, scholarly inquiry, that kind of stuff. What kinds of things do you see as being relevant to the student with respect to academic freedom? And this is going to dovetail into my next question that I'm going to put out there to everybody.
So are you asking how it applies to us in the classroom?
Yeah, so what is it for a student to pursue academic freedom? You've talked about evaluating instructors, and there is a kind of freedom to say what you want to say to an instructor, albeit anonymously, but there's still a kind of freedom that allows for. But I'm thinking more in terms of the academic side of academic freedom. How does that relate to you?
Yes, sir. So I think like we talked about earlier in classes, like you said you taught philosophy.
Yes. Mhm.
I think when we have topics like that, government philosophy, having open debates in class, even if it's not a debate class, letting all sides for especially students be shown without it causing a disruption, just to let everybody show others how they think. I think that's a really big thing in the class that helps us.
So that marketplace of ideas, being able to share your ideas without fear of any kind of what's the word I'm thinking of here, William?
Repercussions.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. You can ask China. She knows.
Yeah,
Thank you.
she did. Yeah. So yeah. All right. So dovetailing from that into this, are there any restraints then? And we've touched on this a couple of places, and we have a question from Marcia here, from Marcy, I'm going to get to here in just a minute, but that relates to this. But are there any restraints on academic freedom? And if so, what are they? And if so, why are there restraints? And if not, why aren't there any?
Well, I don't think there should be restraints on faculty members' research specifically. I think that scholarly inquiry, whatever you want to pursue in your research, I don't think that the institution should be in the business of telling any instructor, any faculty member that their research isn't acceptable, even if it is of questionable value in the community. But in the classroom, there are definitely some constraints, and the most specific one is that the discussion has to be germane to the content of the class. And I'll give you an example of a real world example. An instructor in, I can't remember where this instructor was, but there was an engineering professor at a university who, in his own personal research, was a Holocaust denier. Which I want to be real clear is a viewpoint that I am personally offended by, right? But as long as he kept that viewpoint out of his engineering classes, then the university said he was free to engage in that research. His own research agenda was fine, but it was not germane to an engineering class. So there was no reason for him to talk about his belief in the Holocaust not actually happening in his engineering classes. So I think that the most obvious one is there's no place for an instructor to be bringing in content that isn't germane to what this class is about. In other words, just me and my British literature class talking about my political opinions isn't particularly relevant. Christi Dayley in her government class talking about political opinions is much more relevant, right? It's much more germane to that class.
Well, let me add something to that. I think the other thing you have to be careful in the classroom is misinformation. And that's especially true in a class like mine, where you do have lots of, ideas out there and lots of people saying one thing or another. What comes to mind was the last election. And there are plenty of folks who think that there was massive voter fraud across the country that resulted in what happened with the election. And it's difficult in the classroom to say, well, I understand you think there was voter fraud, but the evidence doesn't support that. And you have to be careful because you have to know what that evidence is, right? You can't just say, no, that's false. That's not true. You have to be able to support it and say to your students, I know that this idea is out there and you're hearing this, and maybe the sources that you're hearing from you think are reliable or verifiable, but you've got to get the information that's accurate to the students as much as you can in that regard as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've told students about, this is not about academic freedom exactly, but literary interpretation. Students will sometimes say, I'm entitled to my interpretation. And I'll say, yeah, you are. Sometimes it's wrong, though. It doesn't, just because you're entitled to have it doesn't make that interpretation right.
Yes. Yes.
I think those opportunities give, or those situations, the misinformation stuff you're talking about, Christy, they give an opportunity for another kind of level of instruction. So I'm thinking, as you're talking, I'm thinking in my class, if somebody were to bring something like that up, it'd be an opportunity to kind of travel through some logical puzzle and say, well, let's say that that were true.
Right.
What would the implications of that be? What would we do about it? What, you know, so, and that's a way of kind of going down that route without saying this is true, or perhaps like somebody in my case, maybe I don't have the information to know that it's false, right? Or I'm not aware of it or whatever. And so this has happened before where students like, they'll raise their hand and they'll say, what about this? And I have no clue what they're talking about. So I just have to say, well, let's say that it is true. let's think about it here, right?
Yeah.
Related to that as well, another layer or something that's related to that is I think it's a safety net for scholars is the practice of peer reviews, rigorous peer reviews. I'm on the editorial review board for a couple of journals. And so, you have the right to pursue truth, but you also have other people have a right to, subject your claims to rigorous peer reviews that, professional standards. And you have to be, that's the responsibility part of that as well, is that you have to be able to allow your research, your ideas to be put, under that microscope and examined by your peers. So that competence in your subject matter is really important as well. And I agree as well. I think it's important you stick to the, is it relevant to the discussion, to your topic? Someone else said that, we have to know the difference between a lectern and a soapbox. And I think that's really important because that impacts the students as well. They're not here to listen to our personal views, but they're here to get an education. So.
But I think that does work both ways, though, Dr. Mathew, because for the students, as we've established, students have academic freedom as well in the classroom. And I would say in the example that Christy's talking about, the student has the right to say that they think there was voter fraud in class. They have the right to make that claim. But if they were writing that in a paper, for example, for your class and treating that as verified through the evidence, you as the instructor have the right to say this doesn't meet the standard of evidence, in the same way that the peer reviewers for the work that we publish say, yeah, your work doesn't meet this standard. It's not good enough to be published yet. And so I think there's a similar sort of process at play there. And I think that can be tricky for students because I have heard students in the past complain, well, this paper, I got a lower grade because you disagreed with me. And I had to point out, no, it's not because I disagreed with you. It's because you didn't have sufficient evidence to support the claim that you were making. But that's a fine line, I think, for students if they know. And I think this is one of the reasons why, and again, I think it's different in different disciplines. One of the reasons why I go to great lengths to not talk about my political views in class, because I don't want students to come to that conclusion that something they wrote in a paper, I graded them down because I don't like what they said. I'd much rather them come to the conclusion that I've graded them down because the point wasn't supported well enough or the evidence wasn't credible or whatever.
Well, academic freedom is tied to the First Amendment, freedom of speech, So students have that right to express, their feeling or what they think. And you as an instructor also have the right. So again, like you said, Dr. Smith, that's why you as the professor make those corrective, take those corrective measures to correct the students and put them in the path of truth. What is happening in the society is usually students get this information out there in the social media, maybe from the politicians, maybe from somebody else. But we must remember that the history of academic freedom has a long implicit history in response to totalitarian state of, like a repressive form of government, started with science and academia, when the way back in, of course, in 1575, somewhere along that time. And how ironic, if I may go back to what Christi Dayley said a little earlier, how ironic that in 2020, history could have been repeating itself again when we have leaders who don't believe in the science of the pandemic, okay? And this ideology, with that ideology of not believing in the science of the pandemic, could morph itself and then get into so many quarters into the classroom and could have consequential implications in the academic field and in the scientific field as well. So this is where truth matters. You as the professor in the classroom and student to be able to share the truth. And that truth can then is what shapes the democratic process as well as the institution we know as our government or United States.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Alex, for that. So I think that I want to change gears here, and this is going to, Marcy, I haven't forgotten about your question here. I've got it pulled up. So I'm going to read Marcy DeShara's question here, and then I'm going to connect it to some other questions that I've already kind of prepared here, because I think these are very well related, and it connects to this idea of restraint and how restraint should be thought about. If there's restraint, is it restraint that's imposed by the institution? Is it self-restraint, that kind of stuff? Or is it restraint that is imposed by some other outside factors? So Marcy's question is, if the community standard is challenged and protest ideas that are developed within the academic context, what is the role of the institution? Should community standards inform a local institution of higher education expectation of instruction? And what I have here kind of along with that is questions about the relationship between academic freedom and changing social standards of language and behavior. And I've got some examples that we can probe into, but I want to take that and go into Marcy's question first. So, and if you want to review that,
what does she mean by community standards? Is she talking about language specifically, religious standards?
I think any of those.
Yeah, I think anything like that, I would imagine. And Marcy, you can hop in on the chat or you can add to your question if you want to here, but I would imagine that any of those would be relevant. Any kind of community standard that is there some imposition of that onto the institution? What do they have an obligation to pay attention to not pay attention to? What's the expectation of those standards on higher education?
Well, I mean, I'd say that we use the term sometimes the academic community. And to me, those are the standards that most directly inform academic freedom. And the academic community is not local, right? There may be different attitudes, different standards in place in different geographic localities, but those should not impose any particular restrictions on the academic freedom of those the people working at those institutions, because again, those are people working in the standards of the academic community, not the local community. I mean, we've been talking about this without saying it in these terms exactly, but I think it's really important right now to draw a line between academic freedom and responsible teaching, right? There are lots of things that might be covered under academic freedom, in my opinion, but that may not always be the most responsible approach to teaching in the classroom. So I would say that a good instructor probably is aware of community standards and may allow those standards to inform his or her approach to what they're going to do in the classroom. But I don't think that that community standards should inform the institution's response to that. I don't think an institution should say, well, you might be able to say that at this other school, but you can't say it here. The one exclusion, and this again, I'm sorry to keep referring to it, but I'm a textual scholar, so I always go back to the text. And for me, the text is the AAUP 1940 statement on academic freedom, which is sort of codified this idea in American academia. And they have a specific exclusion for religious institutions. And they say that a religious institution, if there are some restrictions that institution is going to put on the faculty member, it just needs to be upfront. They need to say that upfront. These are things that you can't say at this school because of our religious identity. But otherwise, and especially at public institutions, it should be the academic community standards, not the local community standards, that govern how the institution deals with academic freedom, in my opinion.
You are so right, Dr. Smith. Let me just add a few more things to this. The AAUP statement covers up to community colleges, but in some quarters, in some areas, some individuals would think that because in community colleges, we don't have research going on, they are not protected by AAUP. No, you are protected by AAUP in terms of what you teach in the classroom and how you conduct your teachings in the classroom. But then the dangerous arena is when it gets to the high schools. For example, now we are teaching more dual credit settings. When it comes to the high school setting, that doesn't protect us. I mean, the academic freedom does not pertain to the high school equivalent. So when you begin to teach dual credit courses in a dual credit environment, and you begin to have pushbacks or interference, unreasonable interference from parents, that there could cloud the whole academic freedom granted to the faculty member who is teaching that course. So what we have not done very well as an institution, when I say institution, I'm not talking about Weatherford College, but I'm talking about all higher institutions, is to explain to our ISD partners that when we come into their environment to teach, we teach the truth, and the community interference must not interfere in what we do.
Yeah, no, that's okay. You're good. We got you. But I would agree with that. I think that what needs something that, and this is probably a discussion for another time. I don't know that this has, it's tangentially related, but I don't know that it has a direct relation here. But the question of whether dual credit is a high school class or a college class. If it's a college class, then it seems like the issues we're discussing here are completely relevant, and there should be no real difference. But there is
the answer to that question is very clear, because it's a college class, because they're taught under the college rubric.
Right. But the difference, right, you're absolutely right. But the difference, like if we're thinking in terms of legal standards and that kind of thing, the difference clearly is that the kids that we're teaching are younger, and they're not protected by the same kind of privacy laws that our students are typically protected by, and that kind of stuff. So it's, you get parents calling you and asking about grades and instruction techniques and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, there is this tension here, even though the principles are the same, I think. Does anybody have anything else they want to add to that?
I would just say too, institutional support is really important for academic freedom, and I think that's something that should be protected. And this is this is something, I like to look to, consider the history of some of these concepts. And we see, that, like I said, academic freedom goes back centuries. And even you can go back to ancient Africa. You have the Library of Alexandria. These were protected ideas back then, where they weren't, the scholars weren't tied to any particular philosophy or school of thought, but they were allowed to investigate, to study, to inquire, and students were allowed to write manuscripts. They were allowed to travel and seek out different scholars. And so that same spirit where it started has to be supported today and carried forward by the institution as well. And I think it's also important because there's an important link between academic freedom and innovation, because a lot of our innovations, they start at public universities. If you look at Silicon Valley and Stanford and some of these institutions, are advances in technology, pharmaceutical industries, they began there. And so I think the institution has an interest in that as well, to protect academic freedom for those reasons.
Just to kind of insert this here, Shelley Hampy has added in the chat that as a previous public school teacher, Shelley, I think this is you. Make sure it's not really identifying people very well here, but as a previous public school teacher, I would argue that responsible academic freedom is the same. All right, so we've got about 5 minutes left before we need to wrap up. Let me reiterate to the attendees here, to the audience, that if you've got a question, please feel free to ask your question in the QA section. We got a few minutes left here, so questions are certainly welcome. Let's turn, as we wait to see if there's any questions here from the audience, let's turn the discussion now towards the kind of responsibility that academic freedom places on us. So here I'm thinking in particularly of the kind of virtues, intellectual virtues that go along with being an academic, as well as China, as well as being a student. That there's a set of intellectual virtues that if you want to be a good instructor or a good academic, then you'll follow. If you want to be a good student, you'll follow these kind of virtues of academia. And what in particular I'm thinking related to academic freedom, what academic freedom kind of calls us to do is to have, to seek the truth and to seek academic or scholarly inquiry with integrity and with responsibility. So can you guys speak a little bit to the kind of role that responsibility plays, the kind of heighten, or maybe not heighten is the right word, but the kind of role that responsibility plays more, and I'm thinking here moral responsibility plays with respect to academic freedom?
I'll jump in. Supreme Court case from the 1960s, Engel versus Vitale. It had to do with prayer in school and the fact that your teacher shouldn't be leading you in prayer. That if you want to pray, go ahead and pray. But if your teacher leads you in prayer, then that's the state advancing religious beliefs. And I think the same can be said of whatever you're teaching in the classroom. Your teacher's or your students are going to look at you, and they're probably going to listen to what you say and be impacted by it. So the way you present your facts or your lecture, I think, has to be tethered with the fact that you recognize you're influencing their beliefs. And you have to be delicate with that. And you have to be careful with that. And you have to be responsible when you're guiding a lecture or guiding a course in general, to make sure that you recognize the impact you're having on your students, or potentially could have on your students.
Yeah, I mean, I'll I guess I would separate a little bit the sort of responsibility of academic freedom and the responsibility of teaching, because I think they're related, certainly, and they inform each other. But there are there are a lot of questions, again, about like what we can do and what we should do, which are not always the same thing. right? And so I think that academic freedom does grant an instructor a lot of grace. It says, okay, you can try that and see if that's going to work in the classroom, but that also suggests that an instructor in the classroom should have that sense of responsibility toward their students. And there have been cases recently about, for example, the use of the N-word in class. And now, obviously, let me be clear, we're talking about the use of the N-word as an insult. There is no circumstance in which that is appropriate in the classroom. But if you're studying a text that contains that word, whether it's a literary text, of studying Huckleberry Finn or Richard Wright, or whether it's, there was a law school professor who was referring to a court case that had the word in there. And there's this question of, does academic freedom allow for an instructor to use that word in the classroom in an academic context? And I would say, yes, it does allow it. That's not the same thing as saying that that's what you should do, though, right? And I think that a responsible teacher, I remember years ago, I was trying to make a decision about something I was going to do in the classroom. And my wife asked me the question, she's not a teacher, should be probably, but she's not. She asked the question, what's it to you? In other words, what do I get by using a word like that might inflict harm on my students? And it may not be necessary to advance whatever topic we're talking about, may not be necessary to get closer to truth. Like, what's the benefit of this? And I think the responsibility of the instructor is to always weigh those things. What impact are you having on the student? What is the benefit of whatever decision you're making? And to make sure that you are, acting in an open-eyed and responsible way at all times, thinking about your students and how you can, get them where you want them to be without causing any harm at the same time. And that's difficult, I think, sometimes.
It is difficult, especially.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Alex.
Absolutely, I agree with you. If the N-word is used in the classroom in the teaching process, that's okay. That's perfectly okay. However, you as the instructor, you have an obligation. That's why it is in a classroom, it's an academic, you are there to change attitudes and behaviors. And when you introduce that word, you have an obligation to make sure that word is not just the same way, the same phrase.
Alex, I think we're having a bad connection with you, so I'm going to throw it to somebody else here.
Sorry about that. I keep losing my connectivity for some weird reasons. I don't know. Again, academic freedom is all about changing attitudes and behaviors. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Yeah, William, I was going to say it is difficult, that line you're talking about there, because especially when we're in an environment where we're encouraged to be cutting edge and innovative in our teaching style and instruction style, for a lot of people, that means that maybe a shock value or a humor value that could be offensive to some students, right? So how do we cross that line between being mundane and dull in the classroom and being cutting edge and thought-provoking that pushes that envelope without knocking it onto the floor,
Well, and I'll put it into the context that Alex especially would understand, because physicians are taught to do no harm, right? First, do no harm. But of course, sometimes the physician has to cut you open to solve the problem, and that feels harmful at the time, right? It hurts, the things that you have to do. So I think, again, it's about weighing the benefits and the harm. So certainly there will be things that happen in a classroom that make some students uncomfortable. And I think if a student is never uncomfortable in their college education, they've missed some significant opportunities, right? Because we should be made uncomfortable. But there has to be some benefit. There has to be some payoff for that discomfort. It can't just be harm for the sake of harm. It has to be harm for the sake of some later benefit that gets them, again, closer to truth, closer to understanding, that broadens their world in some way. You know, there's a lot of responsibility there. I like, by the way, Dr. Mathew comparing us to Spider-Man earlier, because I like to think of instructors as superheroes.
Yeah.
A lot of responsibility.
China, what do you think about this conversation about an instructor doing something that may potentially be offensive to students, or pushing students in ways that are uncomfortable for the betterment of the student? Does that?
I think having controversial topics in the classroom is something that's bound to happen, something that helps broaden the students' thoughts on the subject. And once again, like I said earlier, having open discussions about it, how it makes them feel, how they feel that it should be used. And I feel like the topic we're using right now, making sure that personal beliefs about the word or how you feel about it don't overlook how you're trying to teach it within the book.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's
So,
interesting what you're talking about there. Also, it underscores the idea that true academic freedom is going to, like, from the instructor's perspective, if we're truly exercising it in the proper way, it is going to result in students who feel free and are also academically free to pursue those topics.
exactly. Greg, let me, one more thing. If you, as an instructor in the classroom, if you are not ready, or you don't feel, you are not capable of making people feel uncomfortable and then correct it, then you are not teaching them. Because if you leave out certain controversial topics out of your teaching in the classroom, you are further perpetuating or propagating those false narratives, or you are further propagating those negative or harmful words or phrases out there in the society. So in the classroom, you can change a lot of minds by bringing that up. I say this all the time, because my MO is to make people feel uncomfortable so that they can become honest brokers. So you make people feel uncomfortable in your classroom, then you teach them to become honest brokers. And that's what it's all about. And again, as China said, you have to make a scholarly inquiry, have a debate, have the students to be involved and have a conversation about it. By the end of the conversation, you've changed a lot of minds, and you have impacted them positively, or maybe negatively, who knows? But it is part of the process.
Very good. Well, it looks like we're running out of time very quickly here. Don't have any other questions from the audience. Do you guys have any last comments that you'd like to share with us?
Just that I want to see China on more panels.
Yeah, me too. She's super smart. I really
All right.
Thank you.
Lots of wisdom.
Yeah, you have been pegged, China. You are on a list now. So
Well, thank you. I enjoyed being a part of this.
very good. Well, that just leaves me to thank you guys, Dr. Mathew, Ms. Dayley, Dr. Smith, Dr. eBay, China. Thank you all very much for being a part of this. I think it was very interesting and successful conversation. And we did have a question not related to the topic, but just a question about whether this is going to be uploaded. Just so that you guys know, we are recording all the sessions. I'm not sure in what format or where they will be available for people to rewatch and look at, but all of the sessions that are being presented today at the conference are being recorded to be made available at a later time. And I'll let Dr. Tarnavieski know that people are asking that question. Somebody's saying here that it's going to be on the YouTube channel in a few days. So we'll send out emails about that, I'm sure, to let you guys know where exactly. So with that, again, thank you guys for being here. Audience, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. And I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. And see you guys later.
All right.